Let's talk about this word redemption and just think about what it originally meant. It's come to be kind of a religious word for us. It has religious significance, spiritual significance, absolutely, but it begins really as a kind of commercial or economic word, referring to what would happen, especially in the ancient world, when through misfortune, could be crop failure, could be health issues, when something that belonged to someone was lost and had to be placed in a condition of debt. And sometimes that debt would eventually turn actually into a condition of bondage or bond servanthood, or we would now sometimes call it slavery, enslavement. And the only way to get out of, whether it was just debt or the more serious reduction to bondservant status or even enslavement that happened as the result of debt, the only way to get out of that was for the debt to be redeemed. And for the debt to be redeemed, or for the enslaved person to be redeemed, someone had to pay a price to set them free from the bondage of debt. That's what redemption originally fundamentally means. So what's a redeemer? A redeemer is someone who sets someone else free by paying a price. Now, when we think about that as Christians, of course, we immediately think about Jesus Christ, the great redeemer of all of humanity, who paid the price of death to set us free from the bondage we experience to sin. That's absolutely the ultimate reference point of all this. But Jesus is by no means the first redeemer in Scripture or in God's redemptive story. And if you had asked Jesus himself when he was like a college student, who's a redeemer in your tradition, he would have had actually several answers. But I think Jesus probably would have named the most famous redeemer in the Hebrew Bible that I think almost every first century Jew would have immediately thought. If you brought up the word redemption or redeemer, they would have thought of a story, a very powerful story. And it's the story that's found in the book of Ruth. There's this woman named Naomi. She marries a man named Elimelech. They're Israelites, but they move, for reasons we don't know, to the country of Moab, foreign territory for Israelites, not far, but definitely culturally distant. And there they have two sons, and actually their two sons marry Moabite women. And so they have, in many ways, it sounds like a very good life in Moab. They have sons who are married off. Maybe they have the hope of children. But then tragedy strikes this family. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies. And then the two sons die. And the story of Ruth really begins not with Ruth, but Naomi. This woman who now finds herself alone in a foreign land, in a patriarchal society with no kin, especially no male kin, to provide protection for her. And there's a reason that when the Hebrew Bible talks about categories of vulnerability, it talks about orphans, widows, and strangers or foreigners, immigrants. And at a stroke, with the loss of her husband and her two sons, Naomi becomes at least two of the three, and in another sense, maybe even an orphan as well, without kin, without any family to belong to. This is a desperate position for a woman in the ancient world. And so she decides to risk the journey back to Elimelech's hometown, the town of Bethlehem. And there's this beautiful moment where on the one hand, one daughter-in-law decides to stay in Moab, and who can blame Orpah, who says, I'm going to stay in my home country, my own land. But her other daughter-in-law, Ruth, has this beautiful thing she says. She says, wherever you go, I'm going to go. And wherever you lodge, I'll lodge there. And your people will be my people. And your God will be my God. And Naomi and Ruth make this journey back to Bethlehem, Elimelech's hometown, full of vulnerability. But there's another layer that we might not readily appreciate, because actually, how does it sound to you going back to Bethlehem? That sounds pretty good. You know, oh, little town of Bethlehem. I mean, it sounds nice, how still we see thee lie. That's not what Bethlehem meant at this moment in Israel's history. Because actually, Bethlehem, the name and the place, is associated with maybe the most terrible thing in the entire Bible. A terrible event that happens at the end of Judges, the book that comes right before Ruth, just maybe a generation or two before the story of Ruth. There's a Levite who marries a woman from Bethlehem. We know her only as the Bethlehemite. They're traveling from her hometown to another town. They stop in a city. A terrible crime occurs in which the woman, along with another young woman, a maid of the one who's supposed to be hosting and protecting them, is given over to violent men from the city who all night, it's terrible to have to talk about this, all night assault, rape, and torture the Bethlehemite and the other servant girl. And at the end of the night, she dies of her wounds from the assault on the threshold of the house where the Levite is staying. It's really one of the most disturbing things in the Bible. And the Levite himself, who loved his wife, is so disturbed, he takes her body back, and when he gets home, he cuts her up into 12 pieces and sends a piece of her corpse to every tribe of Israel to say, this is the kind of injustice that's happening in our country. And this leads to a terrible civil war. And this means that what Bethlehem meant, the moment you said Bethlehem, you activated that story in the mind of everyone living at that time. The Bethlehemite was the one who suffered that violence. And so for an unmarried immigrant woman to move to Bethlehem, that's not just one more place you could go. That's like the worst place you could go. It's going to instantly bring up all that trauma, all that history. I suppose it's something like if you met a young person who was about to start high school, and you're like, oh, you're going to be a freshman in high school. Where are you going to be? I'm going to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And we just instantly tense up. Bethlehem is where Naomi has to go because she has no choice. She gets there. Of course, she'd be remembered, but she's been away a long time. The woman said, is this Naomi? And she said to them, call me no longer Naomi, a word that means pleasantness or sweetness. Call me Mara, a word that means bitterness. For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? And this is where redemption begins, with bondage and bitterness. Naomi has lost everything. Elimelech, her husband, is dead. His land is now in the property of another. It's been alienated from their family. Her honor is gone. Her safety is gone. Redemption begins with bondage and bitterness, and there is some of it in every place, in every community, every country, every industry, every economic sector, even in places where there can be real love and loyalty, as there is between Ruth and Naomi. There's also this sense something has gone wrong. I think about girls so often in our world today who may grow up in a rural area all over the world, and they love their families. They want to provide for their families. They know their families are quite materially poor, and they hear that there are jobs in the city, and so they go out to the city in great hopes of finding a job to serve their family and send money back home. But they end up vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation, the worst kinds of exploitation. There are all kinds of maras in our world. But it can also happen with things even that are very celebrated. There's this guy named Tony Fadell. He basically invented the iPod and then went on to work on the team that invented the Apple iPhone. And just last year in an interview, as he was talking about the effect he sees of the phone he invented on his own teenage children, he said this, I wake up in cold sweats every so often, thinking, what did we bring to the world? Oh my goodness. I remember how excited I was to get on Facebook the first time. It was like Naomi to me. Like the girl I had a crush on from high school was on there. And, there was so much joy and reconnecting with friends. And I'm like, get thee behind me, Mark Zuckerberg. Like I'd never go on that thing now, right? Things that start out so well, that somehow turn to bitterness and even a sense of addiction and enslavement. We think about the footage we see of the civil rights marches of the 1960s and the incredible courage and dignity and power and hope of those marches. And then think about the children of those marches, the grandchildren of those marchers, and how much frustration they feel with what has become of a movement that started with hope, and how much the ongoing legacy of racism and white supremacy affects their lives. And this is just a pattern in human stories, and it's the pattern where redemption steps in. Because what is redemption? It starts with bondage and bitterness, but then it brings, and this is the phrase we've come up with at Praxis, it's the best we can do, at least for now, it brings creative restoration through sacrifice. So I want to go through this phrase a little bit and unpack what we're coming to think at Praxis redemption is really about. And let's start with this word restoration. So the very heart of redemption is the restoring of something that was lost. And this means that redemption is not just about kind of mere technological progress. It's not just about innovation. Now, innovation is not a bad thing. And there are some technologies that really do get better, and things do get better in certain respects in our lives. There are all kinds of comforts that we have that our grandparents didn't have. And some of this progress is genuinely good. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not restoration. It's also the case that sometimes technological progress can go on at a tremendous pace and yet leave fundamental systems of enslavement untouched, leave certain bitternesses entrenched. We have amazing medical technology now. And yet, among other things, for example, we can reduce the risk of childbirth so much compared to other generations, right, and other places. And in most of the developed world since 1990, the rate of maternal mortality, that is, death of mother in childbirth, has dropped by 50% in countries like Germany, France, Japan. In the United States, since 1990, the rate of maternal mortality has gone up by 50%. That's not a technological problem. That's a systems problem. That's some kind of brokenness built into the way we are doing our lives that mere technological innovation is not going to address. At the same time, restoration is not just about turning back the clock and returning to the past. It's not just about kind of roll it back. There's this really interesting moment after Jesus' resurrection in his early appearances in the 50 days in which he's continuing to appear to and instruct his disciples. And Luke tells us about this moment in Acts 1, the very beginning of Acts. When they had come together, they asked Jesus, "Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel?" Because these are faithful Jews. They remember when Israel was its own kingdom, its own people living in as holy priesthood before God. They're like, okay, here we go. Is this now the time? And Jesus says, it is not for you to know the times or seasons that the Father has set by his own authority. So first of all, don't ask me about the time. And then he says, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. All they can imagine when they imagine what the fruit of the resurrection is going to be is just roll back to that kingship of David and the nationhood of Israel. And Jesus says, you have no idea how big my plans are. You have no idea how expansive my vision is. They have no idea what this Holy Spirit is going to be that will be poured out on them just a few weeks later. Or the power that's going to come into their community as they spread out. And these very individuals end up going to the ends of the known earth at that time. But this gospel now has reached us in La Mirada, California. Like, they did not know there was a La Mirada, California. Like, they would have been fine. Like, just give us back Israel. And Jesus is like, there's this place called La Mirada. And this place called Columbus, Ohio. And this place called Kibera in Kenya. And this place called Cape Town. And this place called, Seoul, Korea, and I am planning to send you there. You have no idea what I'm about to unleash on the earth. This is creative restoration. We're not going to be able to easily imagine it because it's way bigger than we can really fathom. And our thesis at Praxis is that in some mysterious way, the source of creative restoration is sacrifice. This is the paradox at the heart of redemption, that there's something about sacrifice that actually unlocks the kind of restorative creativity that the world most deeply needs. So let's think about that for a couple of minutes. What would sacrifice mean? Well, there's two kinds in the story of Ruth. So let's go back to the story of Ruth for a few minutes. And let's think about just the routine acts of sacrifice that you can kind of glimpse or that you see actually sometimes quite clearly in this story. Where is there just routine sacrifice in the book of Ruth? Well, one thing that happens when Ruth and Naomi get back to Bethlehem, they realize that there's this landowner named Boaz who seems like a kind man. He's also a distant relative, and Ruth realizes he might be able to help us. So she goes to glean in his field. Now, what was gleaning? It was this practice commanded in the law where if you owned land, productive land, when it came time for harvest, you wouldn't harvest to the very edges of the field. You'd leave the edges unharvested so that the poor and immigrants in your land, people who didn't have land of their own, could actually do fruitful work. This wasn't going to just be charity where I harvest and then give you something. I was actually going to leave work undone so you could have the dignity of good work and provide for your family even if you didn't have land. This is a sacrifice, right? If you own land, you want it to be productive on your and your family's behalf. But Boaz is a faithful Israelite. He knows God has commanded this kind of just every harvest time, you leave some of it untouched. Because that's sacred to God and to the poor about whom God cares so deeply. So Ruth begins to glean. She benefits from Boaz's just routine sort of holding back, not taking all he could take from his land. But this is a precarious situation. Here's a young, foreign, unattached woman out in the fields with young men working around her, grain growing up high. You can imagine how vulnerable a position this is. And Boaz notices Ruth and notices this potential situation. And he speaks to all the young men who work for him, and he says, don't bother her. And they all know exactly what he means. And he says, actually, provide for her. Leave plenty for her. Allow her to do the work, and don't bother her. And by just setting up this expectation that in his sight or out of it, anyone responsible to him is not going to in any way exploit another, but is going to hold back from, frankly, what most young men in that time and place would have thought was a totally routine thing to take advantage of that situation. Boaz says, no, just as a matter of routine, if there's a woman in our fields, we're going to treat her with total protection, dignity, and respect. And you get the sense he would have, now, pretty clear, Boaz, even at this point, is like, ooh, this is a very interesting new Moabitess in the neighborhood. So he's definitely interested in her, but you really get the sense this is a man who he has decided to live a life that lives within limits, that doesn't exploit, doesn't grab, actually makes room for others to flourish, just as a routine matter. But there is also more radical sacrifice. So some sacrifices are routine, but others are radical, and this definitely happens. So Boaz in no way reaches out to exploit this relationship, but he does get to know who this young woman is. And Ruth decides to do something very bold, extremely bold, very dangerous, could ruin her life and her reputation, or could save her life and that of Naomi, who she cares about so much. She goes to the threshing floor. It's the middle of the night. Boaz is asleep. She lies down next to him. And the text says she uncovered his feet. This is a euphemism. She uncovers Boaz. There he is. He wakes up. He's uncovered. Here's this woman lying right next to him. She's there to ask him for a huge favor, you could say, to redeem the land that belonged to his distant kinsman Elimelech. But what Boaz could easily do in this moment is take advantage of this situation. And he doesn't at all. There's no evidence that he does. Instead, he just says, hello, and what can I do for you? And he listens as she tells him the story. And he says, well, actually, there's another kinsman who legally would be required to redeem the land. But tomorrow I'm going to go to the gate. I'm going to persuade him not to redeem the land, and I'm going to step in. And you have to understand, this was an act of sacrifice, because when you redeemed land, you became responsible for the dead person's property and their lineage. And now you had to act in their interest and the interest of their family rather than in your own primary interest. And Boaz decides to step in front of this other person who could be sort of strong-armed into redeeming the land and be the redeemer himself. It's radical. And of course, Ruth is just as radical. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. She goes to Boaz with all the risk it entails in the hopes of restoring the lineage of her father-in-law. And of course, she's lived all kinds of routine sacrifice, every day going out and gleaning. They have lived this way. This whole story of redemption is built on sacrifice. And what is the pattern here? I think the basic pattern in sacrifice is consecration followed by loss. Consecration, kind of a theological word. It means to hold up and make sacred, offer up to God and say, this belongs to you now. Your people will be my people, your God will be my God, and then being willing to lose whatever you've offered to God and trust that God is going to restore it and use it to restore others. Why is this so restorative? I think it's because when you consecrate something, and then you're willing to lose it, it breaks the power of two of the most powerful drives in human life: control and safety. When you sacrifice something, say, this no longer belongs to me, it's yours, and allow it to be lost if God should will that it be lost, you're giving up control, and you're saying, my primary priority is not being safe. And by the way, control and safety are the two ultimate results of ambition and anxiety. Because the more ambitious you get, the more driven you are to try to control the outcome and make something happen. And the more anxious you get, the more you want to withdraw and become safe. And when we give up control and safety and just consecrate and allow God to take and do whatever God does, we break the power of those two things, which are the root of all idolatry and injustice. And we make ourselves available for God to do something much more than we could imagine. That's one pattern, but there's another order that this can happen in, and it's just the opposite order. And in a way, this is in the Ruth story as well. And it's when you've experienced loss you never would have sought, loss you never would have chosen for yourself or your family. But here you are. Naomi has lost her husband. She's lost her sons. Ruth has lost her husband. And what do you do with that loss? You can become bitter, and for a while Naomi does that, or you can consecrate that loss to God. So sometimes we consecrate something and then are willing to lose it, but other times we lose something before we ever thought to give it up. And then what do? You can offer it up to God. It's like what happens when Joseph is trafficked by his brothers into slavery, almost left for dead, sent off to slavery in Egypt, spends all these years in prison. And something happens in prison to Joseph that when he's reunited with his brothers and reconciled with them, he's able to say, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. Something happened after that loss in which Joseph offered it up to God and began to trust that God was going to use it in a restorative way in spite of everything he saw around him. And isn't this then the essence of what happens on the cross? Jesus, who could hold on to equality with God as something to be grasped, instead empties himself and takes on the form of an enslaved person. Humbles himself, even to death. And on the cross, consecrates that loss to God. And out of that comes the hinge of history, the turning of all stories, the beginning of the redemption of all things that Amy spoke about so powerfully. So what are we going to do? If we want to be part of God's story, we're going to choose sacrifice. Routine sacrifice, radical sacrifice. And then we're going to take whatever our losses have been or will be and offer them to God, trusting that God can use them. And what happens as a result? So let's just think about this story for one more moment. What's restored, or who's restored because Boaz and Ruth sacrifice in this powerful way? Well, first of all, Naomi was restored. The land is back in the family. She now again has a place in the community. The productive capacity of the land is that family's to steward again. And she's Naomi again. She's no longer Mara. She's back to pleasantness. She has a family, eventually offspring, and she's part of a community. But of course, it's not actually just Naomi who's restored. It's actually, in a way, Elimelech, the dead guy. His line will now continue. The blessing of ancient Israel was, may you see your children's children. Well, Elimelech didn't live to see it, but now he will have, in a fictive sense, fictive kin, children who will remember his name, and even we today will remember his name. He's not lost. He's not forgotten. And then, of course, it's not just sort of restoration backwards, but restoration, in a sense, forwards, because it turns out that Boaz and Ruth, obviously they get married, right? But this is not like a romantic comedy that's just about these two. It's about the parents, and then it's about the descendants. So they become the parents of Obed, he becomes the father of Jesse, and Jesse becomes the father of David, the great king of Israel. They're part of David's line. That's why we tell this story. And that, of course, means, as Matthew's genealogy reminds us, that eventually leads to Joseph. And so Jesus himself is counted as part of this story. Boaz and Ruth, with their sacrificial love for one another and their sacrificial love for Naomi, actually lead down the line to Jesus. And that means that in some sense here in La Mirada, California today, we are here because of the way these two people lived. And there's one more thing. And of course, it's what happens to Bethlehem. What does Bethlehem mean on the other side of this story? Going into this story, Bethlehem means exploitation, violence, trauma. Coming out of this story, Bethlehem is a place where Ruth is treated with honor, protection, restoration. The meaning of Bethlehem totally changes. What are the Bethlehems of our world? What are the places when people even just say the name, we flinch or cringe? What would it be like to be part of restoring those Bethlehems? The only thing that really answers our hunger for lasting change in the world, the only thing that offers hope for our own limitations, losses, failures, is redemption. And redemption has come into the world. So we pursue sacrifice and risk, not safety and shallow success. We consecrate our suffering, our losses, our constraints, our failures, as well as our gifts and talents. And because God is redeeming and renewing all things, we offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. Thank you.